What happens when a humble housekeeper is accused of a crime she didn't commit? Can she stand up against the powerful and expose the truth? What if the true criminal is someone everyone trusts? In this story, Maya Velasco fights for justice, uncovering secrets that could bring down a powerful empire. How will this trial unfold? Stay tuned to find out. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. The grand courtroom of the New York District Court echoed with the sound of whispers, like a slow-moving tide of judgment, each murmur an accusation before the trial even began. People crowded the aisles, some scribbling in notebooks, others leaning in for a glimpse of the drama that was about to unfold. The media was already anticipating what would undoubtedly be a quick and easy conviction. The case seemed simple enough. A Filipina housekeeper, accused of stealing $5,000 from the room of Miranda Lancaster, a well-known and influential businesswoman. Maya Velasco stood at the front of the courtroom, small, almost invisible in the vastness of the room. She was a housekeeper, someone who had spent most of her life in the background, cleaning rooms, making beds, and ensuring that wealthy guests at the Imperial Grand Hotel were treated with the utmost luxury. But today, she was no longer invisible. Today, she stood in front of a judge, a prosecutor, and a room full of people ready to judge her. Her simple white blouse and black skirt were modest compared to the suits and dresses of the lawyers and spectators. She could feel their eyes on her, their judgmental stares that saw her not as a woman, but as a maid, a servant who didn't belong in a courtroom. Maya, who was used to the whispers of the rich and powerful, now faced the whispers of the entire room, each one cutting deeper than the last. On the other side of the room sat Miranda Lancaster, the alleged victim. Dressed in an elegant designer dress, her flawless makeup and perfectly styled hair screamed wealth and power. She sat in the front row, her posture rigid with confidence, like a queen observing her subjects. To her, this was just a formality. She had already won. She was untouchable, and everyone knew it. Maya, to her, was just another faceless employee who had dared to take what didn't belong to her. And at the center of the room, on the elevated bench, sat Judge Gregory Whitmore, a man known for his strict demeanor and cutting remarks. He had a reputation in the legal world as someone who didn't tolerate excuses, especially from people he deemed beneath him. His piercing eyes, set deep within a face that rarely moved from its stern expression, swept across the courtroom, briefly lingering on Maya. He had already made up his mind about her. She was nothing more than a petty thief, a nobody trying to play in a world she didn't belong to. With his black robe flowing as he moved, he adjusted his glasses, preparing to start the trial. Judge Whitmore was the kind of man who never bothered to hide his opinions, especially not when it came to those he considered lesser. Maya stood there, her hands clasped together tightly, doing everything she could to control the fear rising in her chest. She had never been in a place like this before. This was not her world. She had spent so many years cleaning the rooms of the rich, but now she was standing before them, accused of theft. The prosecutor, Ethan Caldwell, rose from his seat, his tailored suit and sharp features matching his arrogant attitude. He had a reputation for never losing a case, especially when the stakes were high. And this one certainly was. The wealthy elite had paid him handsomely to ensure their interests were protected. The case seemed open and shut. Maya had been alone in the room with Miranda Lancaster's belongings, and the money had gone missing shortly after. Ethan's smug grin never left his face as he turned to the jury, who were looking at him with the same level of awe and admiration as the spectators in the room. He knew he had them in the palm of his hand. His voice boomed across the room as he began his opening statement. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, "what we have here is a simple case of theft. A housekeeper, a woman who had access to one of the most luxurious suites in the hotel, decided to take advantage of her position and steal from one of our city's most respected guests. He paused for dramatic effect, his eyes scanning the room for any sign of doubt. Miranda Lancaster is an honorable woman, one who is known for her generosity and success. It is beyond comprehension that she would be targeted by someone so beneath her, a woman whose only role is to clean and serve. The words felt like daggers aimed directly at Maya. She could feel the weight of them pressing against her chest, but she refused to let them break her. She held her head high, trying to ignore the harsh whispers around her. She had to stay strong for her family, for herself. Ethan continued, "Now, ladies and gentlemen, we have all the evidence we need. Security footage, eyewitness testimony, and of course, the stolen money which was never recovered from this defendant's possession." His gaze shifted toward Maya, and for a moment it felt like the whole room was holding its breath. This is a clear case of deception and theft. There's no question about it. Maya stayed still, not letting a single emotion show on her face. She had heard these kinds of things before, the words of the powerful who thought they could break the will of someone like her, but she wasn't going to break. Not today. Judge Whitmore nodded as Ethan finished his statement, then turned his gaze toward Maya. His voice was cold, as though he were speaking to a stranger, not a human being. "Miss Velasco," he began, "do you have anything to say in your defense?" He let out a small chuckle, as if he already knew the answer. "Perhaps a tearful apology for your actions." The room seemed to hold its breath as Maya remained silent. The audience, reporters, and even the jurors looked to her for a response. They wanted her to break down. They wanted her to beg, to show fear. But Maya didn't give them that satisfaction. Instead, she raised her head slowly, meeting the judge's eyes with a gaze that was not filled with fear or submission, but with something else. Certainty. Her voice was calm, steady, as she replied, "I have nothing to apologize for." The room fell into an uncomfortable silence. It wasn't the response they were expecting. It wasn't the pleading, trembling woman they had imagined. Instead, it was a woman who knew exactly what was going on and wasn't about to let herself be crushed under the weight of the powerful. The prosecutor scoffed, shaking his head. "So you're going to fight this, huh? You really think you have a chance?" His tone dripped with mockery. "You think you can win against all the evidence we have?" But Maya didn't flinch. She didn't react. Instead, she stood tall, determined to fight for her name, for her dignity, and for the truth. The game had just begun, and Maya Velasco was ready to turn the tide. The tension in the courtroom grew thicker as the prosecutor continued his arguments, but Maya knew that today would not end as they expected. Today, she would prove them all wrong. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as prosecutor Ethan Caldwell stood tall, his well-tailored suit immaculate, his posture rigid with confidence. He had the perfect case, or so he thought. The whispers from the gallery had quieted as he prepared to make his opening argument, his eyes scanning the jury with the arrogance of someone who already knew the outcome. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Ethan's voice rang out, smooth as silk, yet dripping with contempt. "Today we have a very simple case before us." He paused, letting his words hang in the air before continuing. "The defendant, Maya Velasco, a lowly housekeeper at the Imperial Grand Hotel, has been caught red-handed stealing from one of the wealthiest and most respected women in our city, Miranda Lancaster." Ethan glanced over at Miranda, who sat smugly in the front row as if the entire court had already declared her victory. She gave him a subtle nod, confirming that her wealth and influence would win the day. The prosecutor couldn't help but smile at her assurance. After all, he was on their side. "I have here," Ethan continued, "all the evidence we need to ensure that justice is served." He walked over to the podium and placed a stack of papers in front of the judge, making sure the jury could see the documents clearly. "First, We have the transaction record showing that $5,000 was withdrawn from Miranda Lancaster's account on the night of the alleged theft. He pointed to the record as if it were undeniable proof of Maya's guilt. This was the exact amount of money that went missing, and it was taken just hours after Maya entered Miss Lancaster's suite. Ethan's eyes narrowed as he glanced back at Maya. He could already feel the victory slipping through his fingers, and that made him eager to strike. "But it doesn't stop there," he said, his voice rising with excitement. "We also have security footage showing that Maya Velasco was the only staff member who entered Miss Lancaster's room that evening." He held up the footage, displaying the image of Maya entering the suite, her face neutral, as she went about her duties as she had so many times before. Maya's heart pounded in her chest as she watched Ethan's theatrics. She couldn't afford to show any weakness, not in front of the judge, the jury, and certainly not in front of Miranda, who was now looking at her with the smug certainty of a woman who thought she had already won. But Maya wasn't going to let that happen. Not today. Ethan's voice grew more authoritative as he continued. "To top it all off, we have a witness, a hotel security guard named Aaron Rivers, who saw Maya leaving the hallway outside the suite looking nervous and in a rush." He turned toward Aaron, who was sitting on the witness stand, nodding along as Ethan pointed to him. "Mr. Rivers will testify that he observed Miss Velasco's anxious behavior as she made her way down the corridor shortly after leaving Miss Lancaster's room." Maya could feel all eyes on her, the weight of their judgment crushing her. They were all waiting for her to break down, to confess, to show some sign of guilt or fear. But Maya did none of those things. She didn't even blink. Instead, she stood tall, her head held high, her posture unyielding. She was not afraid. Ethan looked at her, his eyes narrowing. He could feel his victory slipping, and he wasn't going to let that happen. "So, ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he said, his tone dripping with arrogance, "the evidence is clear. The money was stolen, and the defendant is the only one with the means and the opportunity to commit the crime. She has been caught red-handed, and now we must ensure that justice is served." He turned to Maya, a smug smile crossing his face as he prepared to finish his argument. "Miss Velasco," he said, leaning toward her, "do you have any explanation for your actions? Do you have any excuse for why you would betray your position of trust and steal from someone who treated you with respect?" He let the question hang in the air, expecting her to falter, to break under the pressure. But Maya didn't flinch. She didn't even look afraid. Instead, she took a slow, deliberate breath before speaking, her voice steady and calm. "If I stole the money, then where is it?" she asked, her tone unwavering. The courtroom fell silent. It wasn't the response anyone had expected. Ethan, for a moment, seemed taken aback, as though he had never considered that question. Where was the money? The missing $5,000 was nowhere to be found. Not in Maya's locker, not in her apartment, not in her bank account. No trace of it had ever been recovered. Maya met the prosecutor's gaze with unshakable certainty, her eyes daring him to answer. She had already turned the game around. The room was now on edge, no one daring to speak, not even the judge, who had remained silent since the question was posed. Ethan's confidence wavered. His face, usually so composed, now looked flustered as he quickly glanced at the evidence he had laid out. There were transaction records, security footage, and testimony from the security guard, but none of it proved that Maya had taken the money. It was the perfect setup, an accusation with no proof, a simple question that shattered the narrative they had so carefully built. Ethan tried to recover, his voice faltering as he looked back at the jury. "The money was taken," he said, trying to regain his momentum. "It had to be taken, and you're saying there's no evidence of it being in your possession. That's absurd. There's no way that could happen unless—" He hesitated, but before he could finish his sentence, the silence in the courtroom was almost deafening. Maya's calmness had begun to chip away at his resolve. She was not the helpless maid everyone had thought her to be. She was strong, intelligent, and most importantly, she wasn't going to let herself be silenced. Judge Gregory Whitmore leaned forward in his seat, his sharp eyes now focusing on the defendant. Maya could feel the weight of his gaze on her, but it wasn't the same gaze of condescension she had received earlier. There was something different in his expression now, something uncertain, as though the situation was no longer as simple as he had originally believed. Ethan opened his mouth to speak again, but the words seemed to catch in his throat. The silence grew louder, more uncomfortable. He tried to adjust his suit, his movements betraying his insecurity. The evidence was supposed to have been foolproof, and yet Maya's simple question had undermined it all. Maya looked at him, then at the jury, her gaze unwavering. "I'm not the one who stole the money," she said softly, but her words rang out like a bell in the quiet room. "And I'll prove it." Her voice didn't shake. It was firm, confident, and it resonated in the courtroom, leaving the jury to wonder what she had up her sleeve. As Maya stood there, the prosecutor's confidence had shattered. The room, once filled with whispers of judgment, now hummed with a new kind of tension, the kind that comes when a victim turns the tables on their accusers. And for the first time since the trial had begun, Maya felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel before: hope. Maybe she could win this after all. The air in the courtroom was thick with tension. All eyes were on Maya Velasco, whose quiet defiance had already stunned everyone in the room. The prosecution had been sure of its case, but now, Maya had just thrown a wrench into their carefully crafted narrative. The question she had posed, "If I stole the money, then where is it?" still hung in the air, unanswered. She had completely disrupted the case, and now it was time for her to finish what she had started. Maya had remained silent, letting the pressure build. Ethan Caldwell had tried to regain control, but the self-assurance that had marked his earlier statements was now replaced with unease. He had no answer, no counter to the simple truth Maya had pointed out. With a steady breath, Maya took her turn. She could feel the eyes of the jury on her, their skepticism still lingering. She wasn't just defending herself anymore. She was uncovering the lies that had been hidden behind layers of deceit for so long. She had prepared herself for this moment, and now it was time to bring the truth to light. Maya stood and walked toward the evidence table. "Your Honor," she began, her voice calm and measured, "I would like to submit a new set of bank statements into evidence." Judge Gregory Whitmore glanced up at her, raising an eyebrow. This was unexpected. "Go ahead, Miss Velasco," he said, gesturing for her to continue. She handed the documents to the bailiff, who passed them to the judge. The room had gone quiet. The prosecutor seemed to sense the shift in momentum and stiffened, his gaze fixed on the papers Maya had just presented. Maya's voice remained steady. "These are bank statements from Miranda Lancaster's personal account. As you can see, there was a withdrawal of $5,000 on the night of the alleged theft, just hours after I left her suite." The courtroom fell into an unsettling silence. Maya's words settled in the air, but she wasn't finished. "What you will also notice, Your Honor," she continued, "is that the next day, that same $5,000 was transferred from Miss Lancaster's account to another one, a different account entirely. The money was never stolen by me. Miranda Lancaster took it herself and covered her tracks by pinning the crime on me." The statement was like a bombshell. The room was frozen, all eyes fixed on the papers in the judge's hands. Prosecutor Ethan Caldwell was visibly rattled. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for his notes, flipping through them desperately, trying to find something that could counter the irrefutable truth that Maya had just presented. But there was nothing. His carefully constructed case had just been torn apart. Maya stood still, waiting for the weight of her words to sink in. The bank records in the judge's hands were undeniable. There was no denying the facts. Miranda had withdrawn the money herself and transferred it elsewhere. The evidence was in front of them, and it couldn't be ignored. Ethan cleared his throat, his voice shaky as he tried to regain his composure. "Your Honor, these statements, these could have been tampered with. There's no guarantee they are legitimate." His voice rose with desperation. "This is just one last-ditch effort to discredit the victim in this case." But his words barely had an impact. The judge sat back in his chair, his eyes now narrowing as he glanced at the papers before looking up at Miranda Lancaster, who was seated at the front of the courtroom, her smug expression faltering. Maya could feel the shift in the room. The tide had turned and she wasn't finished yet. "I have one more witness," Maya announced, her voice now cutting through the tension in the room. The prosecutor's face drained of color and the spectators leaned in, eager to see what she had up her sleeve. Daniel Cortez, the former accountant for the Imperial Grand Hotel, entered the courtroom. As he took the stand, Maya's gaze remained steady. She had trusted Daniel to come forward, knowing that his testimony would be the final blow to the case against her. Daniel was a man in his early 40s, his demeanor calm but serious. He adjusted his tie as he took his place at the witness stand. Ethan Caldwell shot Maya a look of annoyance, clearly frustrated that she had managed to pull yet another surprise out of nowhere. "Mr. Cortez," Maya began, her voice even, "could you tell the court your connection to the Imperial Grand Hotel?" Daniel cleared his throat before responding. "I was the senior accountant at the Imperial Grand for over 3 years, Miss Velasco." He paused for a moment, clearly unsure of how to proceed. "I was fired under very suspicious circumstances." Maya nodded, her eyes never leaving Daniel's. "And what happened after your dismissal?" Daniel hesitated, then said, "During my time at the hotel, I noticed irregularities in the hotel's finances, small amounts missing here and there. At first, they seemed like harmless mistakes, but over time, I realized something larger was happening." He looked at the gallery, his expression grim. "I discovered that Miranda Lancaster had been embezzling millions of dollars from the hotel's accounts. She had been funneling funds into personal accounts, disguised as operational costs for years." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. The jury's eyes widened, and even the judge appeared taken aback by this revelation. "Can you explain why you were fired, Mr. Cortez?" asked Maya, her voice steady. "I was fired," Daniel said, "because I brought these discrepancies to the attention of my superiors. I was told to keep quiet, but when I refused, I was terminated without cause. They didn't want the truth coming to light." Maya let the words sink in. The room was silent, the implications of Daniel's testimony hanging heavily in the air. She wasn't just defending herself anymore. She was revealing the truth about the corruption that had been allowed to fester in the hotel for years. Miranda Lancaster, the supposed victim, was the real criminal. Daniel continued, presenting records of the fraudulent transactions, deposits made under false pretenses, money transferred to accounts with names that didn't even match the hotel's ownership. It was a web of deception, and Miranda was at the center of it all. Miranda's expression, once confident and smug, now began to shift. Her hands gripped the armrests of her seat, her knuckles white. She was starting to look less like the victim and more like the culprit. Maya could see her nervous glances, the way her breathing had quickened. Miranda was starting to panic. She had underestimated Maya. And now, the walls of her empire of lies were beginning to crumble. The final blow came when 2 former employees of the Imperial Grand Hotel entered the courtroom. One was a former bartender who had worked at the hotel for over a decade, and the other was a housekeeping supervisor who had been dismissed after raising concerns about the hotel's financial management. As they took the stand, They each confirmed that they had been fired after discovering financial discrepancies related to Miranda's activities. They had been silenced, replaced by employees loyal to Miranda, who had no questions about her actions. But now, their voices could finally be heard. The room was in chaos. Reporters scrambled to take notes, while members of the jury exchanged uneasy glances. Miranda Lancaster, once the powerful woman who had walked into the courtroom with the confidence of someone untouchable, was now sitting in stunned silence. Her facade of control had shattered. She was no longer the victim in this case. She was the criminal, and it was all coming to light. The courtroom erupted into whispers as the reality of the situation set in. Miranda Lancaster was no longer the woman everyone had once admired. She was a fraud, and Maya had just exposed the truth. The courtroom, once buzzing with murmurs of doubt and whispers of condemnation, had grown silent. The tension was unbearable, like the calm before the storm. All eyes were fixed on Judge Gregory Whitmore, who just moments ago had been on the verge of dismissing Maya's defense with a sneer, believing her to be just another helpless maid caught in a lie. But now, as the weight of the evidence had settled in, he seemed to be rethinking his initial assessment. For the first time since the trial began, Judge Whitmore looked uncertain. The courtroom's atmosphere had shifted from one of assured victory for the prosecution to a nervous stillness, as though the air itself had thickened with the reality that things were not as they appeared. Miranda Lancaster, the once powerful businesswoman, now sat in the defendant's seat, her demeanor deflated. She was no longer the confident, arrogant figure she had been when she entered the courtroom. Now she looked small, almost fragile, her face pale, her hands trembling slightly in her lap. The walls had closed in around her, and she had nowhere left to hide. Ethan Caldwell, the prosecutor, stood at his desk, his face flushed with anger and frustration. He had tried to hold onto his narrative, tried to paint Meyer as the villain in this story, but now all of it was unraveling before his eyes. The evidence was irrefutable. The witnesses, including Daniel Cortez and the former employees, had completely dismantled his case. Maya was innocent, and Miranda was guilty. Ethan's confidence had turned to desperation as he tried in vain to salvage his reputation, and the case that had been handed to him on a silver platter. Judge Whitmore shifted in his chair, his face grim. His initial mocking tone toward Maya had been a reflection of his bias, a bias that he had carried with him into this trial, believing her to be just another servant, someone who couldn't possibly stand up to the likes of Miranda Lancaster. But now, seeing the truth laid bare before him, it was clear that he had gravely misjudged the situation. "Miss Velasco," Judge Whitmore began, his voice steady but lacking the earlier contempt, "you have been accused of theft and dishonesty. But after hearing the evidence and considering the testimonies provided, it is clear that you are innocent of these charges." The room exhaled collectively, a quiet sigh of relief that Maya had so desperately needed. She had endured so much first, the humiliation of being falsely accused, then the weight of watching everyone believe she was guilty. But now, for the first time, Maya felt the burden begin to lift. She stood tall, the relief in her chest palpable but contained. She had won, and now it was time for justice to be served. Judge Whitmore's gaze shifted toward Miranda Lancaster, who had been sitting quietly, her eyes darting from one side of the room to the other, as if searching for a way out. The luxury of the courtroom, the crisp, expensive fabrics of her clothing, the scent of power she had once radiated, all of it seemed to evaporate as the judge's eyes bore down on her. She no longer seemed like the queen she once was, but a common criminal, caught in the net of her own lies. "Miranda Lancaster, you have been charged with financial fraud, perjury, and the obstruction of justice," Judge Whitmore continued, his voice carrying the weight of his newfound resolve. The evidence presented in this courtroom has shown that you deliberately framed Miss Velasco for a crime she did not commit, all while covering up your own years of embezzlement and fraudulent behavior. Miranda's face contorted in disbelief as she heard the words. Her grip tightened on the arms of the chair, her knuckles turning white. She had built her entire life on deception, on manipulating those around her, and now it was all coming to a crashing halt. Her empire of lies had crumbled, and there was no escaping the consequences of her actions. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat, like a block of ice that had frozen her voice. You are hereby arrested for the charges of financial fraud, perjury, and obstruction of justice, Miranda Lancaster, Judge Whitmore declared, his voice now firm and resolute. Bailiff, take the defendant into custody. There was a collective gasp from the gallery as the bailiffs approached Miranda. She rose from her seat, her movements slow, as if she were moving in a dream. The reality of what had just transpired was still sinking in, and she looked as though she might collapse under the weight of it all. But the bailiffs had no patience for her shock. They quickly handcuffed her wrists, the cold steel biting into her skin. Miranda's face flushed red, and her eyes darted to the spectators in the courtroom, as if searching for anyone, who might come to her rescue. But there was no one. The people she had once controlled, the powerful elites who had turned a blind eye to her corruption, were now watching in silence. Her downfall was complete. The media, which had once vilified Meyer as a thieving maid just hours ago, now scrambled to adjust their narrative. The reporters rushed forward, cameras flashing as they aimed their lenses at the handcuffed Miranda Lancaster, who was being led out of the courtroom in disgrace. The story they had written was no longer true. The real criminal was being taken into custody, and it was clear that they would have to rewrite everything they had published about Maya. As Miranda was escorted out of the courtroom, Maya stood, her hands trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the overwhelming relief that washed over her. The truth had won. She had faced the system, the powerful, and those who thought they could control her, and she had prevailed. Justice had finally been served. Prosecutor Ethan Caldwell, standing at the side of the courtroom, looked on with a mixture of anger and embarrassment. He had believed that his connections and his reputation would ensure a quick victory. He had never imagined that Maya, the lowly housekeeper, would manage to turn the tables on him so thoroughly. His reputation was now in ruins, and it was only a matter of time before the Bar Association took notice of his failure to investigate properly. There would be consequences for his misconduct, and he knew it. You failed, Ethan, Maya thought to herself as she caught a glimpse of him, standing motionless in the back of the courtroom. His confidence had been shattered, and now he was left to face the consequences of his arrogance and oversight. As Maya Velasco was officially declared innocent, her heart swelled with the knowledge that she had fought for the truth, and won. She had not only cleared her name, but she had also exposed Miranda Lancaster's web of lies. The victory was sweet, but it wasn't about winning. It was about standing up against the injustice that had been forced upon her, against a system that often overlooked those who were too poor, too powerless to defend themselves. The courtroom had been her battleground, and today she had emerged victorious. She wasn't just a housekeeper anymore. She was a woman who had fought for what was right, and in doing so, she had dismantled a corrupt system. As the bailiffs removed Miranda from the courtroom, the media quickly turned their attention to Maya. The cameras flashed as reporters swarmed around her, asking questions about her victory, her emotions, and what came next. But Maya didn't need to answer. She had already said everything that needed to be said through her actions. She had proven her innocence, and she had exposed the truth. And as the gavel came down, signaling the end of the trial, Maya knew that justice had finally prevailed. The courtroom doors had barely closed behind her, but Maya Velasco could already feel the weight of everything that had happened shifting. The air outside was crisp, the sounds of New York City bustling around her, yet the moment felt almost surreal. The media was still crowded at the steps of the courthouse, trying to catch a glimpse of the woman who had turned the tables on one of the city's most powerful figures. But Maya wasn't focused on the flashes of cameras or the barrage of questions from reporters. She had won, and now it was time to move forward. As she walked down the steps of the courthouse, there was a sense of freedom in her stride, something she hadn't felt before. She was no longer a housekeeper accused of a crime she didn't commit. She was something more now, a symbol of justice, of standing up against corruption, and of fighting for what was right. But what Maya didn't know, what she couldn't have known in the chaos of the trial, was that there was still more to her story. That very afternoon, Maya received a phone call that would change her life forever. "Miss Velasco," the voice on the other end of the line began, "we need you to come to the hotel. There are some documents you need to see." She didn't know it yet, but those documents would reveal that Maya was the rightful heir to the Imperial Grand Hotel. The very hotel she had worked at for so many years, scrubbing floors, making beds, and living a life that had been overshadowed by the opulence of the guests who came and went. The former owner, a wealthy businessman named Mr. Whitmore, had passed away, and as per his will, the majority shareholder of the hotel was none other than Maya. The news felt like a whirlwind, spinning Maya's world on its axis. She had always felt invisible in the hotel, just another worker, just another face in the crowd of staff who were easily dismissed and easily replaced. But now, she was being told she owned it. She was the one in control. Maya arrived at the Imperial Grand Hotel a few hours later, her mind still reeling from the phone call. The grand lobby, with its towering marble columns and glimmering chandeliers, was as impressive as always, but now it felt different to her. It felt as though the very walls of the hotel were whispering her name, as though the place had always been waiting for her to take control. As she walked through the front doors, Maya was greeted by the entire staff, who had gathered to welcome her back. There was no fanfare, no flashing cameras, but the cheers that erupted from the group were genuine. Tears welled up in Maya's eyes as she looked at their faces, faces that had been hidden in the shadows, faces that had always been overlooked. But now they were standing tall, proud, knowing that their new boss understood their struggles. Maya had fought for herself, yes, but now she was fighting for them too. "Miss Velasco," said Carla, a housekeeper who had worked alongside Maya for years. "We knew you were different. We knew you were meant for more than this." Maya smiled, her heart swelling with emotion. She wasn't just here to be their leader, she was here to change the game. "I've been given this chance," Maya said, her voice steady yet filled with resolve, "and I'm not going to let it go to waste. No more corruption, no more mistreatment. From now on, everyone here will be treated with respect." The staff erupted into applause, their relief palpable. The hotel, which had been run for years by a woman like Miranda Lancaster, someone who had used her wealth and status to manipulate others, was now in the hands of someone who understood the real value of the people who kept it running. Maya wasn't just the owner. She was their champion, the one who would make sure they were finally seen and heard. With a firm handshake and a determined look, Maya made her way to her office, her thoughts still processing the gravity of what had just transpired. She now had the power to make a difference, not just for herself, but for everyone who had worked alongside her, who had stood beside her through the hardest moments of her life. As she sat behind the massive desk in her new office, a knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called. The door opened, and in walked Judge Gregory Whitmore, the man who had once treated her with disdain and who had believed she was nothing more than a common criminal. Now, standing before her, his demeanor was different. He was no longer the towering figure of authority he had been during the trial. He was humble. He was seeking something, atonement perhaps. "Miss Velasco," he began, his voice soft, "I owe you an apology." Maya looked up at him, her expression calm but measured. "Go on." "I was wrong," Judge Whitmore admitted, his voice filled with a rare sincerity. "I judged you based on my own prejudices, and I didn't take the time to see the truth. I thought you were just a housekeeper, someone who didn't matter, but you've proven me wrong." He paused, his gaze steady. "You've proven that anyone, no matter their background, can stand up for what's right." Maya smiled, though it wasn't a smile of triumph. It was a smile of understanding. "It's never too late to open your eyes, Your Honor," she replied, her words calm but with a strength behind them that only she could convey. "You see now." Whitmore nodded slowly, a gesture of both respect and humility. "I can only hope that others will learn from your courage, Miss Velasco." Maya stood up from her desk, her hands gripping the edge. "There's more work to be done, Your Honor. This hotel will be a place of fairness, a place where workers aren't just seen as servants. They will be treated with the respect they deserve." As the judge left the office, his footsteps echoing down the hall, Maya felt something deep within her shift. She wasn't just a woman who had been falsely accused anymore. She wasn't just a housekeeper who had been overlooked and underestimated. She was the rightful owner of the Imperial Grand Hotel, and she would ensure that it would never again be run by those who abused their power. When she stepped into the grand lobby, now filled with the voices of the staff, the sense of ownership was unmistakable. Maya Velasco had risen from the shadows, from the back rooms where she had once cleaned and scrubbed, to stand at the forefront of a new chapter. She was no longer a victim. She was no longer a servant. She was a leader, a woman who had taken back her life and now had the power to shape the future. As she walked toward the front doors of the hotel, Maya Velasco didn't just feel the weight of responsibility on her shoulders. She felt the strength of the truth that had carried her this far, and she knew that this was only the beginning of what she would achieve. This was her hotel now, her victory, and nothing would ever take that away.